Good morning, faithful listeners. It is Jen here with P40ministries.com, and I am finally back from my vacation to Mississippi. And I had a pretty good time. The weather was really warm and nice. And if you didn't know that I was gone for a whole week, then that is awesome. I did my job well. I'm really getting the hang of this recording equipment. Finally, I hope you guys do enjoy the sound of this podcast now. It is much different sounding. If you go to my first episode and listen, it is far different than this episode for sure. You can actually hear my voice now rather than hearing just a ton of background noise, which is so great. But today we are in Matthew chapter 8, and this is the first time we are not going to be talking about the Sermon on the Mount for several weeks now. The Sermon on the Mount was 3 chapters long, and it was great, and I really loved learning about it and researching it to talk to you guys. But now we are in Matthew chapter 8, and I'm only going to be reading verses 1 through 4 today. So I'm going to ask that you grab your cup of coffee and your Bible and you listen along or read along with me. And I'm going to be reading at the NIV version of the Bible this morning. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them." Now, these 4 verses in the Bible, though they are short, they are very interesting, and it gives us some insight onto Jesus's character a little bit more. So in verse 1 of chapter 8 here, Jesus is coming down the mountainside. He had just finished his Sermon on the Mount, and all these huge crowds begin following him down the mountain. This man with leprosy, he comes and he kneels before Jesus. So let me just give you a little bit of a backstory on leprosy. Lepers were considered in this time in Jewish culture to be extremely unclean, lower than filth kind of people. They believed that leprosy was something that God had cursed them with because of some terrible sin. In fact, the priests at this time would almost brag about how terribly they treated lepers. There are stories of priests throwing rocks at lepers and mistreating them and just doing all sorts of things to these poor lepers. And leprosy is a disease which causes basically your entire body to be eaten away slowly, inch by inch. It starts with little sores, and they get worse and worse and worse, and you might end up losing a finger after several years, and then you'll lose more fingers, and you'll lose whole limbs, and your body is beginning to decay slowly, and it was very contagious as well. So this was not something that people wanted to be around. In fact, lepers had to stand 6 feet away from anybody when the wind was not blowing in that person's direction. What does that sound like to you? It kind of sounds like a virus that shall not be named that we are going through right now, because we all have to stay 6 feet away from each other. We can't touch, we can't hug, we can't talk to them without a mask on. And this was kind of how leprosy was. These lepers were forced to stay away from these people for 6 feet. That was considered the range, or I think it was like 2 meters or something like that. But that was considered the range that a leper could be in contact with a non-leper, and the non-leper could be safe. So this man, who is a leper, falls down at Jesus' feet. And he says, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." And it's very possible that he stayed 6 feet away from Jesus at this point. But in order to get to Jesus, he would have had to go through that crowd. He probably was dressed in clothing that would hide his condition so that he could get through and hide who he is, so that the crowd wouldn't be appalled when they saw a leper in the midst of them. So this leper is probably dressed completely head to toe in stuff that covers him. And he probably is kneeling 6 feet away from Jesus. But he would have had to go through these crowds of people, potentially getting stoned or killed for this act that he was doing. And Jesus sees the man. And I think in other areas of Scripture, it says that Jesus was moved with compassion when he saw the leper. But Matthew chapter 8 does not say that. Jesus just looks at the leper and he says, I am willing to make you clean. Because the leper asked Jesus, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus says, I am willing. And he reaches out his hand and he touches the leper. That would have been unheard of at that time. That would have been appalling, disgusting. You don't touch lepers. You don't go near them. They are filthy, sinful, horrible creatures that you just weren't supposed to touch or have any contact with. These people were lower than low. They were dregs of society. They had to live in their own communities together. They weren't allowed to have any contact with friends or family or anybody as soon as they became a leper. But Jesus, who is above diseases and viruses and everything, goes up to this man and touches him. This was probably the first touch this man has felt in years. This was probably the first outside human touch that this man had ever felt in who knows how long. And Jesus knew that this man needed this. Otherwise, he wouldn't have touched him. He touches this man and shows his love to this leper. So I want to ask, and I don't want to get too political here. I know that many of you who listen do know me and do know that I tend to get very political. But I want to ask, how can we use what Jesus is doing here, right now, today? How can we use this? Because we're going through a very similar thing right now where we don't want to have contact with other people. We're going through a very similar thing where we have to stand 6 feet away from each other, even if we aren't sick. How can we use what Jesus does here to apply to our life today? Because Jesus is our example. If you are a Christian, you know that Jesus is what we attain to be like. In fact, Christians means little Christs. Jesus' name is Christ. So we are little Christs. We are supposed to be like Jesus. Everything Jesus does is an example of how Christians are supposed to live. So when Jesus here touches the man with leprosy, what are we supposed to do right now in this time? And I just want to ask you guys that, and I'm not making any political statement whatsoever, but I am calling out the fact that I don't see a lot of what Jesus does here in today's day and age. I just don't see it. So Jesus touches this man with leprosy, and he says to him, "See that you don't tell anyone about this, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them." So this gives even more about Jesus' character. First off, he touches this man and says to him, don't tell anybody about this. So this is showing here that Jesus is not here, was not on the earth for his own glory. He was here to save people. He was here as a servant. He was not here to gain fame. So he says, don't tell anybody that I healed you, because Jesus knows he'll be pressed with all of these multitudes all the time around him. He won't have time for his ministry. He won't have time for private prayers to God. He won't have time for any of this stuff. So he knows he doesn't want these multitudes around him constantly. So he says, please don't tell anybody about this. Just go and show yourself to the priest. And that was a Levitical command from the law that Jesus is telling this leper to do. When somebody had leprosy in Jewish culture, they were to go to the priest, and the priest was the one who was going to declare them unclean. And then they would have to go and live in their own communes. But then once they became clean of leprosy, if they ever did, which is it's very unlikely that they ever did, but if they ever did, they would have to go back to the priest and bring a sacrificial gift to God in order to thank God. And the priest would perform a ceremony and would check out the man and make sure that he really is healed of leprosy. And then he would be accepted back into society. He'd be accepted to be allowed to work again, to go back home to his family, to see his friends. He would be allowed to do all these things once he went back to the priest and did this ceremony. And this is another thing that Jesus is showing here. Jesus never told anybody not to follow the law of God. In fact, Jesus was very, very strict at adhering to the Levitical law. And that's another thing about Jesus' character that people just don't understand. They think that Jesus was some sort of radical that came and just changed the law 100%. But no, Jesus even says himself, I didn't come to change the law or the prophets. I came to fulfill them. And Jesus follows the law and the prophets to the T. Every single thing that he does is showing the correct way to follow the law. And I find that very interesting. This entire 4 verses, though there is not much here, there's just so much about Jesus' character. First off, he's unafraid. He's not scared to touch people who are sick. He's also not searching for his own glory. And he's also a person who perfectly followed the law of God. And he was not just some crazy radical that came and changed everything about the Bible, but he came and fulfilled everything. And I find these 4 verses just so unique and so interesting. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode today. I hope you learned something from it. And if you want to support P40 Ministries financially, you can go to my website, www.p40ministries.com/shop, and take a look at some of those t-shirt designs in the store. Pick out a P40 Ministry t-shirt for you today, or for a friend, or for a family member, and wear that P40 Ministries logo proudly. But thank you guys so much for tuning in every single morning. I will see you guys tomorrow, 6 a.m. And until then, happy listening and God bless.